The laugh wasn't malicious. It was worse. It was the condescending chuckle reserved for a child playing dress-up. They looked at her sleek black dress, her quiet demeanor, and heard the word Afghanistan, assuming she was a desk clerk making a bad joke. Then the room went dead silent. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was a sea of velvet, crystal, and unearned confidence. Rachel Cole sat at table 14, tracing the rim of her water glass with the pad of her index finger. The glass was sweating. She wasn't. She was simply enduring. Tonight was the annual gala for Apex Logistics, the supply chain management firm she had joined 6 months ago. It was her first foray into the civilian corporate world, a world where the stakes were measured in quarterly margins and the casualties were just bruised egos. Around her, the air smelled of roasted duck, expensive gin, and the sharp tang of designer cologne. To her left sat Amanda, a junior executive who hadn't stopped checking her phone since the appetizers. Across the table was Greg. Greg was the vice president of regional sales, a man whose entire personality seemed built around his golf handicap and a vocabulary heavily borrowed from war movies. He was currently holding court, his voice booming over the low hum of the ballroom, a half-empty glass of Macallan in his hand. "I'm telling you, it was a bloodbath," Greg said, leaning forward. His face was flushed with the thrill of his own story. "When the Chicago team tried to undercut our bid last month, they ambushed us. Pure, unadulterated warfare. I had to pull my guys into the conference room and tell them to lock and load. We took fire from their legal department for 3 days straight. But we held the line." He took a slow, dramatic sip of his scotch. "Sometimes you just have to get in the trenches," Greg added, looking around the table for validation. Amanda nodded without looking up from her screen. A couple of the mid-level managers murmured their agreement, mesmerized by Greg's self-aggrandizing theater. Rachel kept her eyes on her glass. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't sigh. She just kept tracing the rim. "What about you, Rachel?" Greg asked, suddenly pivoting the spotlight. He pointed the base of his glass at her. "You've been quiet. You came over from the public sector, right? Government work?" "Something like that," Rachel said, her voice even. It was a practiced neutrality. "Where were you stationed? DC? Pentagon?" Greg pressed. He possessed the aggressive curiosity of a man who needed to map out everyone's hierarchy, so he knew exactly where to place himself above them. Rachel took a sip of her water. The cold liquid did nothing to wash away the sudden, dry tightness in her throat. She hated this part. She always hated this part. "I was overseas for a while, mostly the Middle East, Afghanistan." Greg's eyebrows shot up. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "No kidding? Afghanistan? Wow, must have been rough out there." "What were you doing? Managing HR for the contractors? Making sure the Wi-Fi didn't drop out in the green zone?" A low chuckle rippled around the table. Amanda finally looked up from her phone, offering a polite, patronizing smile. Rachel looked at Greg. She looked at the smooth, unblemished skin of his face, the perfect tailoring of his tuxedo, the soft hands holding the heavy crystal glass. He had never been hungry. He had never been cold. He had certainly never been hunted. "I was in aviation," Rachel said quietly. Greg laughed out loud this time. It wasn't a mean laugh, which somehow made it worse. It was the dismissive, airy laugh of someone who fundamentally could not conceptualize the woman in front of him doing anything dangerous. Rachel was 5'4". She was wearing a simple, elegant dress. Her hair was pinned back, and she spoke softly. In Greg's mind, a woman who looked like Rachel did not belong in the same sentence as a war zone, unless she was handing out water bottles on a tarmac. Right, Greg chuckled, shaking his head. Supply drops, flying the desk. Hey, logistics win wars, right? I read somewhere that the dining facilities over there had surf and turf on Fridays. Must have been a nice deployment. Yeah, Rachel said, her voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of conversational warmth. It was a real vacation. Greg didn't catch the tone. He waved his hand, dismissing her experience entirely, and turned back to the rest of the table. Anyway, as I was saying about the Chicago merger, when you're in the crosshairs, you have to know how to return fire. Rachel stopped listening. The noise of the ballroom began to warp and stretch. The clinking of silverware against fine china grew sharper, harsher. It morphed. It wasn't a fork on a plate anymore. It was the metallic, rhythmic shuck, shuck, shuck of a 30mm chain gun feeding rounds. The low hum of the string quartet in the corner warped into the deafening, bone-rattling whine of twin General Electric T700 turboshaft engines. Rachel blinked. The soft, ambient light of the chandelier fractured. The smell of roasted duck vanished, replaced instantly by the acrid, chemical stench of JP8 jet fuel, burnt cordite, and sweat. Her hands, resting gently on the white tablecloth, suddenly felt the heavy, resistant pull of a cyclic stick. She wasn't at table 14 anymore. August 2018. The Korengal. The heat inside the cockpit of the AH-64 Apache was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing down on Rachel's chest, trapped behind the ballistic glass and the heavy layers of her flight suit and body armor. Sweat stung her eyes, pooling in the seal of her helmet visor, but she couldn't wipe it away. Both hands were occupied. Both hands were keeping her alive. Reaper 2, this is Outlaw Actual. We are pinned down. I repeat, we are pinned down. Taking heavy fire from the ridgeline to our north. We have 2 urgent surgical. We need suppression now, goddammit, or we are not making it out of this ditch. The voice over the comms was shredded with static and panic. It belonged to an infantry commander on the ground, pinned in a dry wadi by an entrenched enemy element that had ambushed his patrol. In the background of his transmission, Rachel could hear the terrifying rapid-fire pop of AK-47s and the heavy, rhythmic thud of a DSHK anti-aircraft gun. Copy, Outlaw Actual, Rachel said, her voice flat, calm, stripped of all emotion. It was the voice she used when the world was ending. Reaper 2 is rolling in hot. Keep your heads down. Danger close. She pushed the cyclic forward. The Apache banked hard, dropping out of the sky like a stone. Gravity slammed into her, pulling the blood from her head, pressing her back into the armored seat. Through the FLIR, forward-looking infrared screen, the battlefield was a chaotic tapestry of white-hot flashes against the dark, jagged terrain of the valley. She could see them, small, fragile clusters of white heat, the American patrol, huddled behind a pathetic outcropping of rocks. And above them, scattered along the ridge, the rapid, blinking flashes of enemy muzzle fire pouring down into the ditch. Target acquired, her co-pilot gunner, Miller, said from the front seat. His voice was clipped, tight. Give 'em hell, Miller, Rachel said. The Apache shuddered violently as the 30mm cannon beneath the nose roared to life. The noise inside the cockpit was deafening, a deep, mechanical vibration that shook Rachel's teeth. She watched the tracer rounds carve brilliant, deadly arcs through the dusty air, slamming into the ridgeline. Rock and dirt exploded in massive plumes. But it wasn't enough. The heavy machine gun on the ridge swiveled. A stream of green tracers reached up from the ground, lazily at first, and then terrifyingly fast, snapping past the canopy. Ping, ping, crack! The Apache lurched violently to the left. The master caution alarm flared to life on the dashboard, bathing the cockpit in a harsh, flashing yellow light. A computerized voice began calmly listing system failures over the headset. We took a hit to the tail boom, Miller yelled. Rachel's hands danced across the controls, fighting the sudden, heavy sluggishness of the aircraft. The helicopter wanted to spin. It wanted to fall. She wrestled it back into submission, muscles trembling against the hydraulic resistance. I have it. I have the aircraft, Rachel said, gritting her teeth. We stay on station. Outlaw actual. We are re-engaging. Reaper 2, get out of there! You're taking too much heat, the voice on the ground screamed. Negative, Outlaw. We're not leaving you. She brought the crippled Apache around in a wide, agonizingly slow arc, exposing her heavily armored side to the ridge. She was moving too slow. She was a massive, loud target, but she had to draw their fire. She had to pull the guns off the boys in the ditch. The windshield suddenly spiderwebbed directly in front of her face as a 7.62 round slammed into the ballistic glass, failing to penetrate, but leaving a terrifying opaque starburst in her line of sight. Rachel didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head 3 inches to the right to look past it. Rockets, Rachel commanded. Rockets selected, firing. The pods on the stub wings unleashed hell. A volley of Hydra 70 rockets streaked out in front of them, painting the cockpit in a brief, fiery glow. Seconds later, the ridgeline erupted. A rolling wave of fire and dust consumed the enemy position. The heavy DSHK went silent. The small arms fire trickled to a halt. Rachel pulled the Apache up, her arms burning with lactic acid, her chest heaving as the adrenaline finally hit her system. The dashboard was lit up like a Christmas tree, warnings screaming at her to land immediately. Reaper 2! Reaper 2! This is Outlaw Actual! The voice came through the radio. It was no longer panicked. It was exhausted, trembling. Target is destroyed. Medevac is inbound. You saved our lives today, Reaper. I don't know who you are, but I owe you a debt I can never repay. Rachel stared at the spider-webbed glass in front of her face. She tasted copper in her mouth. She had bitten her lip so hard it was bleeding. Just doing our job, Outlaw. See you on the other side. Rachel, earth to Rachel. The sharp snapping sound of fingers pulled her back. Rachel blinked. The dust of the Korengal vanished. The flashing yellow warning lights faded into the warm glow of the hotel chandeliers. The smell of jet fuel evaporated, replaced once again by the scent of roasted meat and expensive liquor. She was back at table 14. Greg was looking at her, an amused smirk on his face. He had literally snapped his fingers in front of her eyes. You zoned out there for a second, Greg said, chuckling. Must have been remembering those five-star buffets in Kandahar, huh? Amanda giggled. Rachel looked at Greg's hand. The one that had just snapped at her. Her heart was still beating a rapid, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She could still feel the phantom vibration of the cyclic stick in her palm. She took a slow, deep breath, forcing her heart rate down, burying the ghost of the Apache back in the dark corner of her mind where it belonged. Something like that, Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. Before Greg could launch into another story about his corporate trench warfare, a loud screech of microphone feedback echoed through the ballroom, cutting through the chatter. At the front of the room, on a raised stage flanked by two massive projection screens, the CEO of Apex Logistics, David, tapped the microphone. The room gradually fell silent, the clinking of glasses fading away as all eyes turned to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, David's amplified voice washed over the crowd. Thank you all for being here tonight. Before we get to the awards portion of the evening, it is my absolute honor to introduce our keynote speaker. David gestured to a tall man standing in the shadows just off stage. Tonight, we are privileged to hear from a man who understands true leadership. A man who understands what it means to make hard choices under unimaginable pressure. He served 22 years in the United States Army, leading infantry battalions in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. He is the recipient of the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and the Purple Heart. He now runs the Vanguard Initiative, helping returning veterans transition their incredible leadership skills into the corporate sector. Greg leaned over the table, whispering loudly to Amanda, "This guy is a legend. Read his book last year. Total badass." David smiled warmly. Please welcome to the stage Colonel Thomas Reed. The ballroom erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Rachel clapped slowly, her eyes fixed on the man walking up the stairs to the podium. Colonel Thomas Reed was in his late 50s. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, but he didn't walk like a civilian. He moved with a stiff, calculated grace, the walk of a man whose knees and back had carried too much weight for too many years. His hair was iron gray, cropped close to his scalp, and his face was a map of deep lines and weathered skin. He stepped up to the podium, placing a small stack of index cards on the wood. He adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces. "Thank you, David," Reed said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and commanded instant authority. He didn't need the microphone to be heard. "And thank you all for having me. It's strange, standing in a room like this, looking at the fine clothes, the good food." Reed paused. He swept his gaze across the front tables, making eye contact with the executives. He believed in looking at the people he was talking to. His eyes tracked slowly from left to right. Table 10, Table 11, Table 12. He looked at Table 14. He saw Greg, who was leaning forward, hanging on his every word. He saw Amanda. And then Colonel Reed's eyes locked onto Rachel. Rachel sat perfectly still. She recognized him instantly. He looked older, tired, out of uniform, but she knew the sharp angle of his jaw and the intensity of those dark eyes. She had never met him in person, but she had seen his debriefing photos. More importantly, she knew his voice. She knew the sound of it breaking over a radio, begging for air support in a dry wadi 8 years ago. Colonel Reed stopped talking. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds. 3. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. David, standing off to the side, looked worried, wondering if the guest of honor had lost his place or suffered a sudden medical issue. But Reed wasn't looking at his notes. He was staring, transfixed, at table 14. His hands, gripping the edges of the wooden podium, turned white at the knuckles. "Colonel," David whispered from the wing. Reed didn't hear him. He stepped out from behind the podium. He ignored the microphone. He ignored the 500 wealthy executives waiting for him to speak. Slowly, deliberately, Colonel Thomas Reed walked down the short flight of stairs leading off the stage. The room held its breath, a profound, heavy silence descending on the ballroom. The only sound was the heavy thud of his dress shoes against the carpet as he walked straight down the center aisle. He was walking directly toward table 14. Colonel Thomas Reed moved with terrifying purpose. The heavy oak podium stood abandoned on the stage, the microphone feeding back a low, confused hum before the sound engineer hastily muted it. 500 pairs of eyes tracked Reed's progress. The ballroom, previously buzzing with the self-important hum of corporate networking, fell into a suffocating silence. You could hear the ice shifting in glasses. You could hear the rustle of silk as people turned in their chairs. Rachel sat perfectly still. The phantom smell of JP-8 jet fuel was gone now, replaced by the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline. She watched him approach. She didn't shrink back, nor did she sit up straighter. She simply braced herself. At table 14, the dynamic fractured. Greg, riding high on the fumes of his own bravado and 4 fingers of Macallan, misinterpreted the moment entirely. As Reed closed the distance, navigating the narrow pathways between the round tables, Greg puffed out his chest. He hurriedly set his glass down and wiped a slightly sweaty palm on the side of his tuxedo trousers. He stood up, buttoning his jacket with practiced corporate polish. Greg assumed this was about him. He assumed the colonel, a fellow warrior, had somehow recognized a kindred spirit of leadership across the room. "Colonel Reed," Greg projected, offering a wide salesman's smile. He thrust his hand out over the centerpiece of white lilies. "Greg Harmon, VP of Regional Sales. It is an absolute privilege. We were just talking about—" Reed didn't even look at him. It wasn't a snub. It was a complete structural erasure. Greg was simply an obstacle in his peripheral vision. Reed walked past Greg's outstretched hand, stepping neatly around the back of Amanda's chair, and stopped dead. He stood directly behind the empty chair across from Rachel. Rachel slowly lifted her hands from the white tablecloth. She placed her napkin beside her plate. She stood up. She was a full foot shorter than the colonel, clad in a simple black evening gown. But as she squared her shoulders, she seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. They stared at each other. The silence dragged out, heavy and absolute. Reed's eyes, weathered and sharp, traced the lines of her face. They were looking for something. They were looking through the makeup, the silk, the soft lighting of the ballroom, digging for the steel underneath. He found it. "I never saw your face," Reed said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the microphone's amplification, yet it carried across the hushed tables. The debriefing reports were heavily redacted. SOCOM didn't want names attached to that operation. They just gave me a call sign. Rachel held his gaze. She didn't blink. They prefer to keep the paperwork light. Reed's jaw clenched. The muscles feathered under his skin. I've spent 8 years trying to put a face to a voice. A voice I heard when I was bleeding out in a dry ditch in the Korengal, watching 2 of my boys fade while a DSAK chewed the rocks to dust above our heads. Greg, still standing awkwardly with his hand half extended, let it drop to his side. His face went slack. Amanda stopped breathing. The entire table was frozen, caught in the gravitational pull of a history they could not comprehend. "You took a hit to the tail, Boom," Reed continued, the words coming faster now, driven by a raw, unpolished emotion. "You were leaking hydraulic fluid. Your dashboard must have been screaming at you to put it down. My RTO told you to wave off. He begged you to wave off. We were dead anyway. He told you to save yourself." "I recall the transmission," Rachel said quietly. "You told him no." Reed took a half step forward. The polished veneer of the keynote speaker was gone. He was a battalion commander standing in the dirt again. "You brought that crippled bird around, broadside to a heavy machine gun, and you drew their fire so we could breathe. You took a 7.62 round to the canopy. I read the post-action maintenance report. 2 inches to the left, and you would have been a red mist against the bulkhead." Rachel's voice dropped, flat and resolute. "But it wasn't 2 inches to the left, sir." Reed swallowed hard. The sharp lines of his face softened, betraying a deep, profound exhaustion. "Outlaw actual," Rachel said, offering the call sign like a hand extended in the dark. "Reaper 2, Reed replied. Then Colonel Thomas Reed stepped back. He squared his shoulders, bringing his boots together with a sharp, imperceptible click. His spine went rigid. Slowly, with an agonizingly deliberate precision, he raised his right hand. The fingers were straight, the thumb tucked, the edge of his hand hovering just over his right eyebrow. He didn't care about the 500 executives watching. He didn't care about the corporate gala. In a room built on unearned arrogance and invisible money, Colonel Reed rendered a slow, solemn textbook salute to the woman in the black dress. It was the ultimate inversion of protocol. The senior ranking officer, the decorated legend, saluting the junior. It was an act of pure, unadulterated reverence. Rachel stood tall, her chin lifted a fraction of an inch. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She carried the weight of the gesture with the quiet dignity of someone who had paid the toll to earn it. Smoothly, sharply, she returned the salute, holding it for a 3 count before dropping her hand back to her side. Reed dropped his. The collective exhale of the ballroom was a physical wave. The silence shattered into 1,000 jagged whispers. Reed finally turned his head. He looked down at Greg. Greg was visibly sweating. The VP of Regional Sales, the man who had just spent 30 minutes regaling the table with tales of his corporate trench warfare and mocking the woman beside him for flying a desk, looked as though he had been physically hollowed out. "Do you know who sits at your table?" Reed asked. The gravel in his voice had turned to cold iron. Greg opened his mouth. A dry, pathetic clicking sound came out before his vocal cords caught. She said she was in logistics, Afghanistan. She was a Chief Warrant Officer 3, an AH-64 Apache command pilot, Reed said, his voice carrying the lethal precision of a sniper's bullet. She flew close air support for Tier 1 elements. She is the reason 22 men, myself included, made it onto a medevac chopper on August 14th, 2018. Reed stepped closer to Greg. He didn't yell. The terrifying thing was how quiet he got. "I heard you talking when I walked up to the stage," Reed said softly. "I heard you talking about bloodbaths in conference rooms, about returning fire from a legal department." Greg swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed violently. "I spend my life trying to help good men and women transition into this world," Reed continued, gesturing vaguely to the opulent ballroom. "And the hardest thing to teach them is how to tolerate the sheer, unbearable lightness of people who play with words they haven't bled for, people who use the language of sacrifice to describe a profit margin." He held Greg's gaze until the VP physically looked away, staring down at his polished shoes. The corporate titan was gone. He was just a small man in an expensive suit. Reed turned his back on Greg, dismissing him entirely. He looked back at Rachel. "They asked me here tonight to talk about leadership," Reed said, his voice warming, regaining its humanity. "They wanted me to give them 10 bullet points on how to be brave when the market shifts. But I can't teach that, because real bravery isn't a strategy. It's a reflex. It's the decision to stay on station when the world is burning around you, knowing you might burn with it simply because the people below you need cover." Reed reached out. Rachel extended her hand. He didn't shake it like a business partner. He gripped it hard, pulling her slightly forward, clasping his left hand over the top of hers. "Thank you, Captain, for my life, for my men." "You kept them alive in the ditch, Colonel," Rachel said, her voice steady. "I just opened the door so you could walk out. Welcome home." "Welcome home, Reaper." Reed released her hand. He didn't go back to the podium. He didn't finish his speech. There was nothing left to say. He simply turned and walked back up the center aisle, disappearing through the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. David, the CEO, rushed back to the stage, frantically tapping the microphone, trying to stitch the evening back together with nervous laughter and confused apologies. But the room was fundamentally altered. At table 14, Rachel slowly sat back down. She picked up her cloth napkin and laid it across her lap. Amanda was staring at her, her jaw slightly unhinged, her phone forgotten on the table. The other mid-level managers were suddenly fascinated by the patterns on the china plates, terrified to make eye contact. Greg slowly sank into his chair. He looked at his half-empty glass of scotch. He reached out to grab it, but his hand was trembling slightly. He pulled it back. He didn't look at Rachel. He didn't say a word for the rest of the night. Rachel didn't gloat. She didn't demand an apology. She didn't need one. She reached out and picked up her water glass. The condensation felt cool and clean against her skin. She took a slow sip, looking straight ahead, comfortable in the quiet, absolute knowledge of who she was. The guns were silent. The sky was clear, and she held the line. Did this story make you rethink the quiet battles people carry with them? Real heroes don't need a microphone, and the loudest person in the room is rarely the bravest. If Rachel's quiet resilience struck a chord with you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who understands true grit. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more deeply human, uncompromising stories every week. We see you. Keep fighting the good fight.